Hello and welcome back to another episode of Beyond the To-Do List. I am your host, Eric Fisher, and today we're shedding light on a crucial skill that could make or break your next big opportunity. It's the art of presenting. Have you ever found yourself standing before an audience in person or virtually? Your heart may be pounding, your palms might be sweating, and you just can't help but focus on everybody that's staring back at you. Well, whether you're in a boardroom, a conference room, a networking event, a team meeting, this art of presenting confidently cannot be underestimated. That's why I was glad to talk with Terri Sjodin, a renowned public speaking and presentation expert, about dissecting the strategies that will turn your next presentation into something memorable. She has a brand new book out called Presentation Ready: Improve Your Sales Presentation Outcomes and Avoid the 12 Most Common Mistakes. And something that Terri says is being boring is the number one mistake with presentations. So we're going to learn how to avoid that, as well as the top 3 presentation pitfalls and how to avoid them. We're going to find out why nervousness can be your ally when captivating an audience, and balancing information with persuasion and strategies for crafting a solid closing that resonates with and prompts action from your audience. So whether you're stepping into that boardroom or hopping onto a sales call or delivering a keynote, there's a ton of information in this conversation with Terri Sjodin. Well, this week it is my privilege to welcome to the show Terri Sjodin. Terri, welcome to Beyond the To-Do List.
Thank you, Eric. I'm honored to be a part of your series. Thank you.
I am glad that you're here. We have not covered presentations in a very long time, if at all specifically, come to think of it. We've talked about having good meetings. We've talked about showing up well on Zoom, but we haven't talked about structuring all the pre-work as well as the then actual presenting of the presentation. So I am really excited to have you here.
Well, I'm excited that we're going to talk about it because it is such a critical skill set. And yet it is one of those things where people go, I've been speaking since I was 2. It's not that big of a deal. But the truth is, when you elevate this particular skill set, it really does change your outcome. So I'm excited to kind of jump in and tell you a little bit about the research and maybe give your listeners some how-tos and some tangible takeaways that they can say, wow, that was really practical and tactical, and I'm glad I listened.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's exactly what we need to do. So before we get into that, I want to say you have a brand new book called Presentation Ready: Improve Your Sales Presentation Outcomes and Avoid the 12 Most Common Mistakes. I love that we're avoiding mistakes, because who hasn't been in a presentation where we were just like, oh my gosh, they're just reading off the slides. And that's just one of them. And that's probably not even like a very big one, although it can be very distracting. So
no, I appreciate you saying that, because, and a lot of people initially gave me a little pushback on like, why are you focusing on the mistakes? And we are focusing on the outcomes, but the gift of honing in on the mistakes is that you really can't course correct something that you don't recognize as being a problem. So by really honing in on these particular areas, you can help people quickly assess the challenges and then fix them and move forward.
Yeah. So I want to jump into some of the mistakes, but before we do that, I know there's some core pieces, pre-work, if you will, when it comes to crafting the presentation before it's actually presented. What's the objective of the presentation? Things like that. What are those core components that we need to be thinking about, especially when maybe we've just randomly been tapped and said, hey, you need to present on this in an hour, although that's almost too short. Maybe it's Friday. They're telling you you're going to present on this on Monday. Oh, crap. What do I do?
Right. So one of the things that we wanted to do when we did this deep dive into this particular topic is I said, look, if we're going to help sales professionals or business professionals to craft more polished and persuasive and effective messaging, then all of the research and all of the data has to come from that specific audience space, right? There could be no research about us without us. So we went to that tribe and we said, okay, looking back over the last 6 to 12 months, is there anything that you did in a presentation that you think cost you a win or a deal or an opportunity? And 94% of the participants said, yeah, if I was honest with myself, there was something I did. So we said, great, we appreciate your transparency. What were those things? And ultimately, there were 12 mistakes that people self-identified that they felt like, maybe if I had addressed that issue before I got started, then maybe I could have changed the outcome. Now, there were 3 mistakes to kind of this is a long way of getting to your answer, but there were 3 mistakes that always rose to the top. And we did this study in 3 phases, right? So phase 1 was pre-pandemic. We launched those results on March 5th of 2020. And then, as you know, the world shut down about 2 weeks later. So we did a second phase of the study right smack dab in the middle of the pandemic, focusing specifically on virtual presentations. So phase 1 was in person, over the telephone, small group, large group, but predominantly in person. Phase 2 was predominantly virtual, which changed the game a skosh, but not a lot. And then phase 3 was in-person, virtual, and hybrid environments. And interestingly enough, the 12 were still the same. And the top 3 biggest mistakes were still the top 3 in all 3 phases of the study, regardless of gender, regardless of the number of years of experience that someone had. And also, it did not matter whether that individual sold or promoted a product, a service, or a cause. Now, as you and I both agree, everybody sells something, right? Whether it's a product, a service, a philosophy, an idea. Most importantly, when you're selling yourself, everybody sells something. So even if you just remember these 3 things as a result of this interview time today, I promise it's going to make a difference. So the number 3 biggest mistake that most people self-confess is that they wing it. They roll in. They roll in hot and they hope for the best. The number 2 biggest mistake that they self-confessed was that they had a tendency to conclude at the end of a meeting or presentation, but they did not close. They did not have an ask. And the number 1 biggest mistake that most sales professionals confessed is that they had become far too informative in nature rather than persuasive when they had a specific opportunity. And again, that was whether they were in person, virtual, or hybrid.
Very interesting. Yeah. It's almost as if, there's that phrase, begin with the end in mind. They're not doing that at all. They're like, oh, I'm just going to show. I mean, again, in my instance of somebody who's been tapped and said, it's Friday, we need you to present this on Monday. That's almost somebody being given permission to maybe wing it a little bit, or at least perhaps in their mind, but they haven't thought it through yet. I love that you're couching it in that context, though, of 1, don't wing it, which I certainly have done. And I'm not proud of saying it still turned out well, but I'm really glad that you brought that up. Okay. So how do we start to flip the switch on these 3 things when it comes to our presentations?
So my background is in speech and debate. I was really fortunate when I was in high school. I had a high school speech coach. His name was Jim Caforio, and he took 3 of us from the time that we were sophomores and really groomed us to be extremely competitive in speech and debate. And I went on to compete on the collegiate level at not only Orange Coast College and at the junior college level, but also at San Diego State University. And what you learn as a debater are really the core essential elements to address those 3 biggest mistakes. You learn that you can't wing it, but you don't always know when you're preparing for a debate what the topic is going to be. So you learn to focus right up front on having a clear understanding of what your kind of top 10 most persuasive and compelling arguments are. So you have them at the ready. Doesn't mean you're always going to use all 10, but you want to have them at the ready. You don't want to be worried about thinking about those kinds of things right in the middle of the moment, right? You want to have that kind of easy access, if you will. So if you then think about the next strategy in debate, which is, what is your constructive outline? We don't use scripting, right? In real life, when you're meeting with someone, you're not using a script. Doesn't mean that you wouldn't maybe write something out ahead of time if you had a lot of prep time. But most of us who are in business or in sales, we use an extemporaneous format, which means you're speaking from an outline. And that outline is much like an accordion. The content of your message can expand or contract based on how much time you have to deliver your message. And you need to be nimble. So just imagine if people really sat down ahead of time and said, okay, I've only got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to block my talk using this outline structure. And of my 10 best arguments that I want to typically address, I think these 3 are going to be the most relevant for the person I'm about to speak to. When you do that, you get your head in the game. And I think that's really the critical takeaway here, that when you get your head in the game and you get focused, you think, what do I need to communicate within the short period of time? Structure it in an outline with, to your point, with the end in mind. What do I want to happen and what do they need to have happen for everyone to leave and think, okay, that was a great meeting. That was time well spent. Because a lot of times people are just data dumping and they think, well, I didn't want to be hard sell. So I thought if I gave them all the information, maybe they would just kind of figure it out on their own. And those are two different concepts. Your job as the presenter is to really help clarify the most compelling elements of your message so that the listener goes, oh, wow, I've kind of heard this before, but the way you're saying it, it's landing in my mind in a different way. And so now I'm intrigued. Now I'm inspired. Now I'm curious. And that's really how your presentation leads to better conversations and better outcomes.
Yeah. So instead of winging it, be prepared as possible, but then open to flexibility.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. You're kind of mentioning there, the whole, okay, well, I wanted to give them all the information. So that leans on the other one you were talking about where it's more informative or overly informative versus persuasive. And then the third one, I think, is the pivoting to not just ending, but closing, like convincing. So what do we do with those two? How do we spin to be not less informative, but appropriately informative, but then spin and close?
Absolutely. So think of it this way. Like the best presentations are a combination of both rock solid information paired with logical persuasive arguments. But trust me, Eric, in the last 25 years, I've never listened to a presentation and said, your talk is too persuasive. It needs more information. Like I've said that never. Why? Because that's not the problem, right? The problem is that people data dump. So again, by helping people to really ask themselves, wow, if I'm sitting in the seat of the listener, what are my most compelling arguments? What are my most compelling talking points? Why should somebody choose me? Why should they choose my company? Why should they do it now? And when you get yourself in the mindset of, if I was a discriminating listener and I was trying to figure out why I should work with this person or this company over another, you're helping them to synthesize the content. That's the gift of a presenter. Look, if products and services could sell themselves, they wouldn't need human beings. They could just go to the interweb, right? They need us. Think of yourself almost like a conductor. You have all kinds of musical instruments that are available to you. And your responsibility as the presenter is to bring in the right music at the right time for that particular listener based on their needs and what their vision is for the outcome. And that kind of leads that from there, when you've built a rock solid case, it does smooth the pathway to your close versus just kind of concluding. I mean, obviously, this is a really giant topic, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. And I think then having that foundation means then when you get to the end, you're able to pivot's not the right word, but transition maybe is a better word for it. That feels into a more natural conversation topic of, so I've presented all the, I'm going to summarize in very blunt terms. Let's go back to grade school and the whole, here's how you write an essay. Tell me what you're going to tell me, and then tell me what you told me. But there's also, when it comes to presentation, there's another paragraph, which is now here's the decision that you have, person that's receiving this presentation. You need to make a decision. Let me set that decision up for you. Here you go.
Right. So there's a classic American film, Glengarry Glen Ross.
Love that movie. Love it.
Where Alec Baldwin in the film says, ABC, always be closing. And I don't think you have to always be closing. I also don't think you have to be hard sell, but you do have to ask the listener to do something as a result of the message. And I think, again, the gift of using debate strategy in a selling environment is that it gives you a very clean, very logical process to do what's a very natural part of crafting a persuasive presentation. And look, no one's shocked. Nobody thinks, oh my gosh, can you believe this, business development representative or this marketing representative or this sales professional came in here, they gave us a full presentation and then they asked us to buy? I'm floored. They're not floored. Like they get it. They know why we're there. But the way we do it, there is an art to selling, and that art takes place in your delivery. And I think if you can beautifully transition, then that changes the way that it lands. So for example, I was working with the gal. She was just a solid mid-range producer, but she just couldn't seem to kind of break through. And when I asked her, what do you think the challenge is? She's like, I know I'm a concluder. I'm not a closer. And I said, tell me what it looks like. Tell me what it feels like. And she says, well, when I get to the end, I'll just say, that's our offering. Do you have any questions? And then I'll say, so what did they say? And they'll say, no, this was great. And I'll say, okay, well, thank you so much for your time. And if you'd like to move forward, let me know. And I'm like, okay, well, do you have any questions? And let me know is not a close. But that is a really normal ending because people feel like, oh my gosh, it would be awkward. And, does it have to be awkward? So there's a little transition line that I like to use. Does it work every time? No, but I'll just say, look, in order to move forward, this is what it would look like. So for example, you could kind of spin around an agreement and say, if you were to say, absolutely, Terri, we would like to move forward, then I would have you sign this agreement. We would require a deposit check, which confirms and holds your event date. And then from there, this is what happens, right? You want them to visualize what's going to happen after they've made that commitment so that they get really excited about doing that. And then you could say, so do you have any questions? How would you like to proceed from here? I think how would you like to proceed from here is a lot better than do you have any questions? Now, they may have questions. They might say at that point, I have some questions. But again, what you're trying to do is really get into the dialogue to encourage them to not feel like it's a high pressure situation, but also don't make the close so difficult. And I think that a lot of times we get in our own way because we just don't ask.
What you just did and gave the example of, it's not awkward. It's not impolite. It's not imposing. It's actually, in a sense, giving them even more value. Essentially, you're giving them more information by giving them so if we were to work together or if you were to decide to go with us or whatever the scenario is, here's what that would look like. This would be the next step and the one after that and the one after that. So they can see that you're easing their apprehension. You're filling in those gaps, those steps. And then without saying, let me know, passive, you're saying, we're really excited about working with you. Like you said earlier, they know what you're there for. So it kind of makes the point redundant to even ask, but you should be asking, not just saying, okay, let us know. That's not a question.
If you have any questions, call me. If you're interested, call me. I mean, you would be really interesting if you could see all of the presentations that we've watched where it's just kind of like this trailing ending. And I don't think it has to be that unpleasant or vague. I think if you just ask a simple question, like, how would you like to move forward? Would you like to move forward? People say, oh my gosh, I'm just so afraid they're going to say no. And, I don't think people say no. I mean, in all my years, I've never gone through an entire presentation, built the rapport, crafted my case, done through everything I was supposed to do. And then at the end had them go, no. That's how what people say. If you're going to be afraid of something, it's probably more likely you're going to hear, I'd like to think about it.
Right.
So the bigger question, the better question for business professionals is, okay, what do I do if I hear I'd like to think about it, which is, again, another whole strategic thing that we can talk about. But all of these things are those challenging, awkward, communication-based issues that a business professional who's selling a product, a service, or a cause, or even selling themselves on a job interview that we don't really address. And I think that's the gift of Presentation Ready. The gift of this book is that each of the 12 mistakes is illustrated by confessions from real world business and sales professionals who shared what their mishap was. And then we shared what the listeners were thinking as a result of their message. And then we give the solutions. So it's very practical. It's quite tactical. It's authentic to what's happening to people in the real world. And I'll be honest, some of the stories are going to make you cringe and some of them will make you laugh, but they're all true. And that's the gift of the learnings. You get to learn vicariously through your peers and come up with alternative solutions for very similar problems.
Now, I know that outside of the crafting and even the polishing and optimizing the presentation, like we've kind of talked about already, there are other components to this, like the example I keep giving. Let's just go there. So say somebody, they need to deliver an impactful presentation, but they've been giving short notice. What do you tell somebody? How do you help somebody prepare and deliver in a really short amount of time?
Right. So there are 3 components to every presentation. There's your case, and that's your structure, like we just talked about, right? So what is the structure you're going to use? What are your persuasive arguments? How are you going to close? Think of that as your case. The second benchmark is creativity. So how will you make that message land? How will it connect? How will they feel comfortable in terms of relating to you? Will they be swayed by a more logical argument? Are they focused on logic, or do you think that they're more heart-centric, pathos, which means that they're probably more story-centric? Or do they need to learn more about your credibility? Are they credibility or ethos-based? So there are ways that we can craft presentations that tap into logic and storytelling as well as your credibility that help to bridge the gap from a much more general perspective. But if you don't know the person and you don't have time to do homework and you can't customize, then you do your, what we would call your go-to arguments. Like, what are your top 3 most successful arguments? What are your top 3 most successful, consistently successful stories? And then you always make sure that you're using kind of a conversational style that's warm and sincere and authentic. That's based on listening to their responses to your questions. And so, you can say, look, this is our first meeting. I'm going to kind of bring you some high level information that will give you an overall perspective. And then as we get into specific areas, feel free to interrupt me if there's something you'd like me to do a deeper dive on. Because, they're not going to expect you to do a full customization if you haven't had much prep time. But again, in the delivery of your message, you want to show them that you're flexible and you can go, slightly off topic or a little bit deeper if you've hit something that really intrigues them.
Yeah. And you're prepared to do that. But again, last minute presentations, you're not going to be too scrutinized. There's a reason it's last minute, and you can kind of couch it in that contextually. So yeah.
Right. And I look, the reason you want to do all of this consistent prep work is that the nature of being a sales professional is that our job is fluid. It is always changing. You don't have these perfect scenarios. So I think of our responsibility, hewing back to the very beginning of our interview today. This preparation piece is about being a prepared professional. Think of it like a football player that's preparing for a big game on Friday night. On Tuesdays at practice, your coach may have you run through tires. I've never seen a player run through tires in the middle of a game. But you do that because you're working on your agility. You're trying to be nimble. You want to work on your speed and your balance. So the things that we're talking about today are really tapping into a similar experience. It's like running through tires so that you're not having to think about it when you're at game day. It becomes intuitive. It becomes second nature. It flows with ease and grace. So it doesn't feel canned, but beautifully prepared. So when those moments arise, you're prepared for them. And here's the gift. I think some of the most incredible opportunities are the ones you never saw coming. So if you kind of keep that in mind, then you'll be prepared for those, I call them gifts, right? Magical gifts. You're like, I wish that happened every day. I'm so glad, I was somewhat prepared. So again, that's not winging it. That's what we would call extemporaneously speaking based on a certain amount of preparation that you've done prior to that opportunity.
Yeah, it's honing the skills so that you can tap into the appropriate skill at the moment you need it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that can only come from practice.
Yeah.
You can't do nothing and wing it. And the more you do it, the more you do it. And the more you do it, the more graceful it becomes. So it seems like, wow, you just did that. It just seems so natural. That was so easy. And you're thinking, yeah, me in 10,000 hours, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so speaking of other skills that fall kind of in line with that, I know that one of the other things that really plays a part, whether it's in person or using digital tools like we're using to communicate right now, has to do with body language. How does that play into presentations?
So one of the things I encourage people to do is just once a year, get one of your presentations on video so that you can see and hear yourself as your clients do. And then that will reveal the things. Now, we all feel awkward when we're being recorded. And from the most basic example, I ask people, like, how many of you went into shock the first time you heard your voice on your outgoing voicemail or phone message, right? We're like, is that me? And most people kind of take one or two other cracks at it, right? They do it over and over and over again until they feel like they've gotten it right. And what does that show us? It reveals that once we become aware of the way that we speak and present, what do we want to do? We want to perfect it. We want to improve upon it. We want to make it better. And so whether it's your communication style or watching your body language and gesturing, whether you're sitting one-on-one, whether you're doing a stand-up small group presentation, or even if you're watching like we are right now, a video or virtual program, you want to look at like, wow, am I looking into the camera or do I find myself looking at myself? How is my body? How's my posture when I'm sitting? What does it look like in the environment around me? There are so many elements now that we have to take into consideration. And the gift of having a good old fashioned cell phone is that you've got a video record capability. Just have somebody record you or take the time to hit record on a virtual call. All of those little things, from that awareness, you can course correct. And, this again is that third benchmark that we talked about, which is delivery. And in that third benchmark of the book, we talk about the 4 mistakes that relate to delivery, which is everything from your eye contact and your body language to verbal missteps, your use of technology in a presentation, or good old-fashioned demonstration failures. There are all kinds of little things that, again, with just a little awareness and just a few tweaks, you can change your outcomes pretty dramatically. And you don't have to suffer. You don't have to guess. We've kind of laid it all out for you. Again, you can learn vicariously through those who have gone before you.
Yeah. I know one of the other things that just is kind of a lingering or a subconscious thing that listeners are probably thinking about when it comes to presentations is, oh no, I have to give a presentation. Not only do they have to do all the prepping, but then they have to actually get up in front of people. It's the whole Seinfeld joke from however many years ago where he talks about people would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. They hate public speaking more than dying. And so when it comes to anxiety or nerves before or during a presentation, what are some ways that we can, I don't want to just say get over it, but maybe utilize that or prepare ourselves for that aspect of a presentation?
I'm so glad you brought this up, Eric, because you're right. Delivering a presentation is still ranked as the number one fear amongst most individuals. It's ranked above death and disease and bankruptcy and blind dates and not so blind dates and visits from a mother-in-law, chicken pox, a whole host of things that people would rather experience than take an advanced presentation skills course or even have their presentation skills analyzed. But this is the gift. It is a game changer, because so many people aren't necessarily comfortable doing it. Now, those people who are comfortable doing it, they give themselves opportunity that those who shy away from those opportunities will not encounter. So if you can give yourself the courage to really kind of work on the skill set, doors will open for you in a way that you couldn't possibly imagine. I call it the great equalizer. It doesn't matter where you went to school, what community you live in, what your background is. And this is what I learned as a speech geek. So, kind of round out our conversation. When I was competing in speech and debate, if you're a speech geek, this will resonate to you. If not, I think you can learn a couple of the key nuggets here. But when you get to a tournament, nobody's wearing matching uniforms. You're wearing regular street clothes. Every participant is given a number. You roll into a tournament room where you give a speech or a presentation to a handful of judges, maybe only one judge with maybe 6 or 7 other competitors. And at the end of 3 preliminary rounds, the kid with the highest or best scores wins and they proceed. They move on to semifinals and finals. Well, I didn't always win. Of course, I wish I did, but I didn't. So if I didn't win, I would go and watch the semifinal rounds and the final rounds because I would want to see what were they doing? What were they saying? Why would people lean in to their conversation? Why would the judges vote for them? And then I would go home and I would tweak my presentations. I would have to make a guess and figure it out. And then I would go back and I would compete in the next tournament with a new and improved presentation. And the takeaway here for this entire interview is really, really simple. You just don't go back out into the field with the speech or the presentation that doesn't win. But business and salespeople do it all the time. And so when you make these little corrections that we've talked about today, you can change your outcomes. You can increase your opportunities. Someone will say, wow, that was a great talk. I want to introduce you to somebody else, or you did a nice job today. I want to introduce you to my colleague. When you focus on it, it could even help you even in a job interview, because people by people. And your verbal communication skills are an immediate demonstration of your professional competency. Are you kind? Are you articulate? Do your ideas resonate in a way that makes someone say, okay, they have great clarity. They're a good communicator. I think they'd be pleasant to have on our team, right? People say people by people. How else do we communicate our peopledom if it's not for our verbal communication skills? And obviously I'm on my soapbox here, but I believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself, your kids, if they're still in school, is to, whether it be Toastmasters or taking a class in college or taking a much more professional course, give yourself the gift of a little bit more training in this area, because I think it can change your life.
I totally agree. I was a communications major. It was nerve-wracking sometimes, but never since training and getting up and doing speaking things, do I not feel that, like, I wouldn't call it anxiety, but just like, okay, I'm anxious to get out there and do this, but also I'm anxious to like make sure it works. And I heard somebody say, well, when you're not nervous or you're not excited or you're not anxious, it means you don't care about it at all.
Yeah, if you're nervous, it shows that you care.
Yeah,
absolutely agree.
It's having your pulse on your own wrist. In other words, checking it, make sure you're still alive. In other words,
I love it. It does. I think there is a little, that adrenaline can be exciting if you can channel it to work for you. And I appreciate you saying all that, Eric, because I do think that on some level, everybody does want to improve their presentations. They just don't know where to start. And again, I think that was my true through line in writing this book. You know, I just wanted to help people to kind of fix the things that they want to fix a little bit faster. And most people do not commit all 12 mistakes. And most people are harder on themselves than I ever am on them when we're working together. What we know from the study is that most people self-identified 3 or 4 of the 12 mistakes. Out of the 5,000 people in all 3 phases of the study, there was one person that said, no, I don't make any mistakes. But of all the others, on average, people kind of identified 3 or 4. And then what's interesting is that we asked those same people, okay, well, these are the top 12 things you self-identified. So who better to judge business or salespeople than other business and salespeople? So we asked, what do you notice if somebody's coming to you and they're presenting to you, pitching to you, selling you? Is there anything they did that cost them a win or a deal or an opportunity? And the answer was yes, overwhelmingly. And there was one specific mistake that always rose to the top. And it was none of the 3 that we've already discussed. So the number one biggest mistake that most business and sales professionals noticed in others that cost the other person a deal was that they were boring. So I do think it's interesting that most people self-identify as being overly informative, but other people are boring. But I do think it's important to also think about, you know, am I bringing a little bit of entertainment value? Because even if you think your topic isn't very sexy, and trust me, I know that our conversation about persuasive presentation skills may not be the sexiest topic, but it is important, and it's our job to bring it to life and make it be a bit more fun so that people are like, okay, maybe I could work on that, and that would change my experiences or my outcomes or my opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's always room for improvement. Like you were saying, you'd be done with your tournament, your competition. So you'd go and you'd sit and you'd pay attention and you'd try to learn from what others are doing. That's what we're saying you can do here and now constantly. I mean, you can even just go watch YouTube videos and pick out mistakes people are making when they do those videos. But again, one of the great resources that you've now brought to the table is your book, Presentation Ready. I'd love to point people to where they can find out more about the book and you and all the work that you're doing.
Well, that is very kind. Thank you. So Presentation Ready is available in bookstores nationwide. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of the independent bookstores, Indie Press, any of the large independents. I love bookstores, so I do hope that you'll support the good old-fashioned brick and mortar stores. In addition, I invite you to visit my website, just go to terrisjodin.com, TerriSjodin. It's Swedish, Sjodin, terrisjodin.com. And from that homepage, it'll take you to all kinds of information about the research study. If you'd like to download complimentary copies of the 3 phases of the research study, that is available in addition to the content and access page for the book itself.
Perfect. Terri, thank you so much for sharing. I know a lot of people got a lot out of this, but are going to get even more out of the research and your site and the book. So thank you so much for being here and sharing.
Thank you for shining a light on this topic. I really appreciate it. You've done such a beautiful job with this podcast. I'm honored to be a guest on your show. So thank you so much and continued success to you, my friend.
Thank you. Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Terri Sjodin as much as I did, and that you were able to pull from Terri's wisdom and have it not just be advice, but an invitation to hone and elevate your skills to communicate with an audience when presenting. That this is truly a skill that you can, with intention, practice and hone. Make sure to go grab your copy of Presentation Ready. You can find it at beyondthetodolist.com in the show notes. That's also where, if you found this podcast helpful, I would love for you to do me the favor of hitting share, either over there on those show notes or in whatever podcast player you're using right now to listen to this. Hit that share button. Share it out with somebody that you know needs to hear it, or share it over to social media. Let everyone you know about it. That would be really helpful to me and helping grow this show. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next episode.